All right, hello everyone. Welcome to the I've Heard of Her discussion series. We are members, employees of the Civil War Museum. We do this once a month, usually in person, but for the past 2 months we are working at home, like most of the country, and so we're doing it online. Today we're talking about Margaret Mead, who is a cultural anthropologist, and at the time of her death was the most famous anthropologist in the world. So I think we should introduce ourselves.
Yeah, so I'm Jenn Edginton. I'm curator of social studies education. If you're not familiar with me or the museum, I do have a bachelor's in anthropology, which is really exciting, and I'm so excited to talk about Margaret Mead. And I also have a master's in education.
I am Samantha Machalik. I'm the registrar. I see our faces are covering what I put, aka the collections paper overlord, because that's basically what I do. I handle all the paperwork related to the collection for the 3 museums that we run. You might be asking, you're a member of the collections department. Why are you doing this program? Well, my education, as you can see, is in history. My graduate school research was focused in women's history, which is why I am very excited to be doing this program with Jenn. Get me doing something a little bit different, and it's awesome.
And our museum, so we're part of the Kenosha Museum campus. We both work for both of the museum, or all 3 museums, but we really are focusing this program out of the Civil War Museum, which is located in Kenosha, Wisconsin.
Yeah.
So Samantha, why do we do this program?
We're doing this program for the 100th anniversary of U.S. women gaining the right to vote, which happened in 1920. As a historian, I feel like I need to say all women did not receive the right to vote in 1920, but that is when the amendment was passed. So we do this program to recognize that women are in history too. A lot of the history we learn in school is focused on men. And so we like to talk about women you may have heard of, but don't really know a whole lot about.
Great. So again, today we're going to be talking about Margaret Mead. So you can see a picture of her on the side here, actually in one of her field studies. But I really quick want to talk about what is an anthropologist. So a lot of times we hear this really big word and we don't necessarily know what it is. And we're really lucky because the Kenosha Public Museum actually focuses on anthropology as one of our 3 main focuses. And an anthropologist is someone who studies culture or people. So a lot of times when we think of anthropologists, we have 4 main branches. There's cultural anthropologists, who are people that actually study cultures that are still living for the most part. So they might go live with them. Margaret Mead is a cultural anthropologist. She's trying to figure out cultures by removing herself from her situation, entering another culture and becoming immersed in that culture. Another one is archaeology. So really looking at that past culture using artifacts and often digging, right? But there's several other types of archaeology. Another is a linguistic anthropologist, so studying the language and how that reflects culture. And then lastly, we have kind of the whole bio-anthro area. So that could be human remains, be it our ancestors, you know, the primate, fossilized, you know, way back when, or more recent ancestral bones. So it's a little bit of both. All right, so that's what an anthropologist is.
Yes. Okay, so today we're going to talk about a very specific anthropologist, Margaret Mead. So she was born in December 16th, 1901 in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Her dad was a professor and her mom was a sociologist and an advocate for women's rights. So early 1900s, this would be access to birth control, right to vote, things like that. And so she grew up in a rather free-thinking household, and it went beyond her nuclear family. Her grandma was a child psychologist. And it said she was the first one to teach her to observe the behavior of children and determine like what they want or what they need. So she has those roots. She had three sisters and one brother. Her school was a little bit unusual in that she went to school, but sometimes only when she wanted to. Like there was a whole year she only did half days, um, because that's what she wanted to do and that's how she learned. I'm sure having a dad as a professor, she had that supplementary education at home, so it didn't really seem to harm her. She joined the church. She was an Episcopalian. She loved the rituals and the traditions that being in a church gave you, which makes sense. All of these things of how she eventually found in her career.
I love the letter that we're kind of hiding, but it's her observations at age 11. So she's watching kids, and we can see Priscilla wants some food on there. And so her grandma is teaching her how to use observations to infer things and try and understand what kids want, what they need. And this is really building kind of the foundation for her anthropology career later on, too. So a little bit more about Margaret's schooling. So after her kind of unusual schooling, she enrolls in university. So in 1919, she goes to DePauw University in Indiana. After about a year, she transfers to Barnard College, and she graduates in 1923 with a degree in psychology. So she kind of sees herself following her grandma's footprint, but she falls in love with anthropology along the way. So she enters graduate school at Columbia, and she is going to be an anthropologist. She is taught by probably one of the most well-known anthropologists besides herself, Franz Boas. He's considered kind of this father of American anthropology. Franz Boas is actually, he was not born in America, which is really interesting. He started doing a lot of work and becoming pretty famous during the World's Fair of 1893, where he was brought in to help the director of ethnography bring in all these different cultures and tell the stories of these different cultures. He also is pretty anti-racist. So he's seen as one of the first scientists to try and move away from race and a race instead of culture. And so he's trying to focus more on the culture and less on the race behind it. And his assistant is actually Ruth Benedict. Ruth Benedict is another very famous anthropologist. She actually becomes Margaret's very good friend her whole life, and a little, and rumor has it a little bit more that they were in a romantic relationship. And Margaret's daughter is the one that implies this in her book. So there's no real hard evidence, but we do know that they are very, very good friends. They often critique each other's work. They often collaborate too. And after Ruth dies of a heart attack in 1948, Margaret kept her legacy alive by supervising her projects and editing and published notes from studies that Ruth had collected throughout her whole life. So Margaret kind of takes it upon herself to make sure the legacy of Ruth does not die with Ruth. And I think that that's a really amazing thing that she was able to do.
Yeah, definitely. She, in addition to furthering Ruth's work, she also did a ton of her own work. In 1924, she graduated with her master's from Columbia in anthropology, and she started her field work in Samoa in 1925. People were really concerned about sending a young woman by herself into the field, but she felt that she was uniquely kind of qualified to study young girls in Samoa in these remote areas because she was so young herself. She said, quote, because I was a woman and could hope for greater intimacy in working with girls rather than boys, and because owing to a paucity of women ethnologists, our knowledge of, well, primitive girls is far slighter than our knowledge of boys. I chose to concentrate on the adolescent girl in Samoa. So she really felt strongly about researching young girls. She learned the Samoan language, was one of 7 languages that she eventually mastered. And direct from the Library of Congress, her research statement was that she sought to discover whether adolescence was a universally traumatic and stressful time due to biological factors, or whether the experience of adolescence depended on one's cultural upbringing. So basically, she wanted to find out if, this kind of trauma that teenagers seem to go through in America was a universal concept, or if people in other parts of the world experience their adolescence differently. And so she spent 9 months there observing and conducting psychological tests. The group that she was a part of actually gave her a ceremony, I guess, honored her in a ceremony, but when she was going to leave. And she found out that it was not a stressful time actually for girls in Samoa, because the Samoan cultural patterns were so different there from the United States. And she wrote a book. I believe in the next slide we have the pictures of her in Samoa.
Yeah, and especially her work was so unique because, like you were saying, young women were not researched, and particularly those going through adolescence and maturity were not talked about during this time. So it's relatively new work. She does write a book out of all of her findings, so Coming to Age in Samoa, and it's released in 1928, and it is a huge success. It is really popular, and it really shows off her skills as an observational person. The one thing I will say is that some people critiqued her work. Everyone has critics, right? But some people critiqued her work because she chose not to stay in a traditional household. She actually stayed in a Navy household with Americans because she felt like she needed to coddle herself a little bit. So she actually wrote back to Ruth explaining why she chose to stay with the Americans and not the Samoans, because she felt like they would look over her shoulder. She felt that she would not like their food or have enough water. So she actually tries to tell Ruth to defend her decision to Franz Boas. So it's kind of this funny, like, if he asks you, have my back, letter that she sends to her. So that's one of the critiques, because anthropologists are supposed to be so immersed in the culture, but her work is still doing amazing stuff.
Yeah, definitely. And as Jen said, Coming of Age in Samoa, it was a huge success. And then in 1929, after she graduated with her PhD, she went and did a field work in New Guinea, in Manus Island. There she studied the play and imaginations of younger children and the way they were shaped by adult society. She wrote another book, Growing Up in New Guinea, about that field work, and she refuted the idea that primitive people were effectively like children, that development needed to be studied in its cultural context, essentially. We can't say that, adults there are primitive based on the technology we have, or that they don't understand it. If they were given the chance, I'm sure they could, type thing. She did a lot of work over in Oceania. She had later work in mainland New Guinea that showed that gender-specific roles and work varied from culture to culture. That was another big thing that she explored and revealed as well.
Yeah, and all of this work and her book, The Coming of Age, is really like skyrocketing her success. And she's now being seen as this household name. So it's kind of like almost like she turns into the scientist that everyone knows, right? And that's not too common. She starts writing columns for Redbook. She also is offered and turns down the Secretary of Health, Education, and Welfare for LBJ, but she does end up advising him. So kind of, no, I don't want that position, but I'm going to help you. She makes an appearance on Johnny Carson. She's huge in the second wave of feminism and sexual revolution. And then also, because we're museum nerds, I have to throw this in there. She works at the American Museum of Natural History. First, she's an assistant curator for almost 20 years. Then she becomes an associate curator, and she has that position for about 20 years too. Then she actually becomes the curator of ethnography for about 5 years, and then she retires and she's the curator, kind of that after retirement, but still associated with the museum. During this time, she also serves as president for big organizations, the American Anthropological Association, the Anthropological Film Institute, Scientists Institute of Public Information, and the Society for Applied Anthropology. And during all this time, she doesn't have enough on her plate. She also wrote 23 books. So she's a very accomplished woman, scientist, and anthropologist, which I think is really incredibly important, and especially because we don't hear too much about her. So, yeah, and a little bit more about her personality, if you will. As you could tell, she's a little open. She grew up in that kind of free-thinking household and still lives in it. She's anti-racist. She feels that the penalty for drug charges in the criminal system should be lowered. She's doesn't necessarily like the title of feminist, but she definitely stands for a lot of the same things as feminism does. She has a lot of opinions on the role of marriage and women's role within the marriage, which is especially pretty not popular when she's starting to have these in the 20s, and she's starting to emerge with this new wave of thinking, which she's meeting a lot of men that disagree with her. So with her, she's definitely, without her liking the title, but she's a lot more embracing those feminist ideals that we often hear of in the 60s and the second wave of feminism.
Yeah, definitely. And speaking of men, she did have men in her life. I know we don't usually cover a lot of men or how men influence. We talked about Franz Boas, but that's because he was her teacher. But we are going to highlight her marriages. She had 3 of them. But before she left for Samoa in 1925, she had a short affair with a linguistic anthropologist named Edward Sapir. He was a friend of Ruth's, actually. They broke up because his views on women and roles in marriage were too conservative for Margaret Mead. Did not care for them. Later, Sapir called her book Coming of Age in Samoa cheap and dull, and then called Margaret Mead something horrible. So, I mean, he probably wasn't bitter at all about being dumped. She actually was married at this time, though. Her first marriage was in 1923 to Luther Cressman. He was a theology student, but became an archaeologist famous for American Paleo-Indian sites like Paisley Caves. They divorced in 1928. Mead called this her student marriage. She wrote him a letter before she left to Samoa saying that I won't leave you unless I find someone I love more. So, I mean, in 1928, she got divorced, and she does, because she gets married right away again in 1928. This one to Rio Fortune, who Jenn thinks is dreamy, and he was
the coolest name.
He does have a really cool name. I will grant you that. He was a New Zealand anthropologist. They were married a little longer. They got divorced, though, in 1935, and he did go with her to New Guinea for part of her field work there. Her third and longest marriage was in 1936. This is to Gregory Bateson. he was an English anthropologist, so she likes to marry within her field. They have a daughter, Mary Catherine, who Jenn mentioned, does write a book about her mother. That's Margaret Mead's only child. Actually, before she had this daughter, she was told she couldn't have children, so it was a pretty exciting thing. Her daughter also has a doctorate in anthropology, but her and Bateson divorced in 1950, and she does not marry again.
And I think what you were saying is like she married in her field, right? And that's part of understanding what an anthropologist is, because they go away for quite a bit of time to do research and then they come back. So maybe that's why.
That's a very good point. You have to be very accepting that your spouse is going to a remote part of the world for months, perhaps years at a time, and you need to, be okay with that. So that's a very good point.
Yeah, especially when she was younger and going by herself to these different nations, where a lot of people were telling her like, hey, maybe you shouldn't go by yourself, take someone else, and she wasn't going to do that. So absolutely. And so unfortunately, right, fortunately she lives a very full life and a very long life, but she does pass away in November 15th, 1979. And when she dies, she is the most famous anthropologist in the world. And I will tell you, you learn about her in Anthropology 101. You learn about Franz Boas, you learn about Ruth, and you learn about her. And you often see her quotes wherever you go, be it a zoo or different cultural museums. You're going to see these quotes all over. But she really seems to be reduced to a quote or two. No one really knows her story. She is awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom in 1979 by Jimmy Carter. The quote that we remember her as is, never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has. And really, that's how people remember her. But she wrote 23 books. She did all this amazing field work. She taught, she worked in a museum, and really it's looking at this quote. And we know her, again, from the quote, from a few different things. One of the things, unfortunately, is Derek Freeman, who has kind of made her popular again in some regards, or resurgent, where he wanted to discredit her work and say it was all a hoax that she fell for by the Samoan people. So they were just putting on an act, basically, and she fell for it, which, no. This guy. So Margaret, I think if you take an anthropology class, you're going to hear about her. But I don't necessarily think everyone will hear from her. But if you lived during that time, you would have seen her on TV. You would have read her in Red Book. So she was very famous at her time.
Definitely.
So if you've seen our program, or if this is your first time, we always like to have some discussion. So it's much better when we can see you in person and we can interact with you, but we hope that you take some time to answer this question in our comments, and hopefully we can get back to you. So we have what, who, / where would you like to study if you were an anthropologist? So think about that one, answer it in our comments. Samantha, do you have an answer for this one?
Oh, geez. Honestly, I did take an Anthro 101 class in college, and my most fascinating, we had to do field work, and my most fascinating thing was we had to go to the store and watch people and how they approach checkout lines, and how people just know how to form a line and just know the proper etiquette. So honestly, if I was an anthropologist, those types of things are the things I would want to study. Like the things we just somehow know how to do in society, I would want to figure out, why do we know how to do those things?
Sure. There was, when I was in anthropology, I think one of my earlier classes, we read an ethnography that was all about karaokeing. And it was about the different approaches people take to do karaoke, and how some people will say things like, oh, you know, be nice to me today, I have a cold, and then go out there and like do amazing. And so that was a really fun ethnography for me to read. I just thought it was silly. And then I wrote an ethnography about firefighters when I was in college, because my dad was a firefighter and was retiring. And so it was all about the brotherhood that comes along with firefighters. And then my work, though, primarily is in archaeology. And so I did a lot of work on a historic farm. I prefer history, or like historic era. So yeah, I worked on this amazing farm that the college owned, and trying to identify perfume bottles that were shaped like violins and fun. I know, and music boxes.
That's so cool.
So when I think about like culturally, I would love to do some kind of thing like the karaoke ethnography, because I thought it was so amazing. Or again, I really enjoyed working with the firefighters because I had that little bit of insight, and so really delving in a little bit deeper. But I mean, who wouldn't want to do an archaeology dig somewhere amazing like Greece, right? So
no
there's a lot of options. A lot of options. So we just wanted to, again, ask this question. Please take time to answer it if you have any thoughts. We'd love to hear. All right.
Yeah.
You want to finish it with us? Or for us?
Sure. So next month is June. We still will be in an online format next month. So please look out for another video coming to you on Facebook around third week in June. We're going to talk about Jane Addams and her amazing and awesome work in Hull House down in Chicago. I'm super excited about that. She is one of my personal heroes. So you'll get to hear me geeking out next month, not next week.
Well, perfect. We're so glad that everybody could join us for our I've Heard of Her, and we hope that we see you again next month.
Yes,
Thanks,
thank
everybody.
you.